Alex was home alone on a quiet Saturday afternoon, enjoying the rare peace in their suburban neighborhood, when a sharp pain shot through their chest like a bolt of lightning. The searing agony made their vision blur, and within moments, they were gasping for air, sweat pouring down their face as panic gripped their mind. Was it a heart attack? They weren't sure, but the intensity of the pain left no room for doubt. Something was very, very wrong. With trembling fingers, they fumbled for their phone, barely managing to dial 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and reassuring, but Alex could barely respond between ragged breaths. The only words they managed to choke out were their address and the desperate plea, "Hurry, I can't breathe." The dispatcher assured them that an ambulance was en route and urged them to stay on the line. But even as those words reached Alex's ears, the darkness at the edge of their vision deepened. They sank to the floor, clutching their chest, their mind reeling with fear. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens cut through the suburban silence. Relief flickered for a moment. Help was coming. But Alex had no idea that their fight for survival was about to take a disastrous turn. As the ambulance approached the entrance to the HOA-controlled neighborhood, the paramedics were met with an unexpected and absurd obstacle. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the community, standing with her arms crossed in front of the gated entrance. She glared at the emergency vehicle as if it were some unwelcome intruder. The HOA had strict rules about who could enter, and in her mind, an ambulance without prior authorization was no exception. One of the paramedics, a tall man named Jake, jumped out of the vehicle, rushing up to Karen with urgency. "Ma'am, we need to get through. This is an emergency," he barked, pointing to the flashing lights of the ambulance. But Karen, unmoved, simply raised a manicured hand. "This is private property. Emergency vehicles must have pre-approved access unless accompanied by a resident," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Jake stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? Someone's life is on the line. Open the gate," he shouted. But Karen merely shrugged, shaking her head. "Rules are rules. If I let you in without clearance, it sets a bad precedent. You'll just have to wait until I get approval from the HOA board," she said, pulling out her phone as if the situation was a mere inconvenience rather than a life-threatening emergency. Meanwhile, inside the house, Alex's condition was rapidly deteriorating. Their limbs felt like lead, their heartbeat irregular and sluggish. They were slipping in and out of consciousness, their thoughts fragmented and hazy. Their phone had fallen from their grasp, the call still connected, and the dispatcher was shouting their name, trying desperately to keep them awake. The seconds ticked by, stretching into an eternity, and the paramedics outside were growing more frantic. "Listen, lady, we don't have time for this," Jake yelled, but Karen remained unmoved. "If it's really an emergency, they should have planned better. HOA policy exists for a reason." Her words were like ice water in the face of desperation. Jake clenched his fists, ready to push past her if necessary. But before he could act, a neighbor, a middle-aged man named Mark, stormed out of his house. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, taking in the scene with growing horror. When Jake explained, Mark's face turned red with fury. "Are you insane, Karen? Someone's dying, and you're playing gatekeeper," he bellowed. Karen scoffed. "It's not my fault they didn't follow the proper procedures." Mark wasted no time. He stormed past Karen, yanked open the emergency override panel next to the gate, and punched his access code. With a loud beep, the gate slid open, and the ambulance roared forward, speeding toward Alex's home. Karen shrieked in outrage, but no one paid her any attention. Jake and his partner burst through the front door moments later, finding Alex barely conscious on the floor. Their skin was ashen, their breathing shallow, their pulse weak. "Stay with us," Jake urged, quickly assessing the situation as his partner prepared a stretcher. Every wasted second could mean the difference between life and death. As they worked, the dispatcher's voice crackled from the fallen phone. "Is help there yet?" Jake grabbed it and responded, "We've got them. Heading to the hospital now." They lifted Alex onto the stretcher, securing oxygen and 4 fluids as they rushed back to the ambulance. But just as they were about to leave, Karen reappeared, standing in their path. "You can't just barge in here and break the rules," she snapped. Jake's patience finally snapped. "Move, or I swear to God, I'll have the cops drag you out of the way," he growled. Mark stepped in again, shoving Karen aside without hesitation. "Get lost, Karen," he spat. The door slammed shut and the ambulance sped off, leaving Karen fuming in the driveway. But the nightmare wasn't over. Inside the rushing ambulance, Alex's vitals were crashing. The delays had cost precious time, and now their life hung by a thread. As the ambulance sped through the streets, sirens wailing in the fading light, the paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Alex. Their pulse was erratic, their breathing shallow. The oxygen mask did little to ease the struggle for air, for fluids dripped steadily into their veins, but the delay had already caused significant distress. Jake, the lead paramedic, clenched his jaw as he read the vitals on the monitor. Blood pressure dangerously low. Heart rate unstable. Time was against them. "We're 5 minutes out," the driver shouted over the noise, swerving through traffic. Jake leaned down, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Stay with me, Alex. We're almost there." But Alex was barely responsive, their eyelids fluttering as unconsciousness threatened to drag them under. The grim reality settled in. The delay at the gate had robbed them of crucial moments. When they arrived at the emergency entrance of the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses rushed out, wasting no time in wheeling Alex inside. Jake exchanged a few urgent words with the ER doctor. Obstructed access by an HOA representative. "We lost precious minutes at the gate." The doctor cursed under his breath as he signaled the team to move quickly. "Get them into trauma. Page cardiology now." As Alex disappeared behind the double doors, Jake stood there, fists clenched, fury simmering in his chest. He had seen a lot of absurd things in his career, but this was a new level of negligence. Someone had nearly died. Not because help wasn't available, but because a self-important woman had decided HOA rules mattered more than a life. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Karen was still causing a scene. Mark, the neighbor who had forced the gate open, was locked in a heated argument with her in front of a growing crowd of concerned residents. "You could have killed them, Karen. What the hell were you thinking?" Mark shouted, his face red with fury. Karen, arms crossed, was unrepentant. "The rules exist for a reason. If we start making exceptions, what stops people from abusing the system? It's about maintaining order." "Order? You denied an ambulance access to a dying person. You psycho," a woman from the crowd yelled. Karen scoffed. They should have planned better. If it was such an emergency, why didn't they have pre-authorization filed? Mark looked at her in utter disbelief. "You are actually insane," he muttered. By now, someone had already called the police. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing against the perfectly manicured lawns of the HOA-controlled community. Officer Ramirez, a seasoned cop with a no-nonsense attitude, stepped out. He took one look at the agitated crowd, the furious neighbor, and the smug woman standing in the middle of it all, and knew this was going to be a mess. "All right, what's going on here?" he asked, looking between Mark and Karen. Mark wasted no time. This lunatic blocked an ambulance from getting to Alex's house. They were having a medical emergency, and she refused to open the damn gate. Ramirez's face darkened as he turned to Karen. "Is that true?" Karen lifted her chin, completely unfazed. HOA policy states that emergency vehicles require prior clearance or resident escort. I was following the regulations. The officer blinked. "You blocked an ambulance? For an emergency?" "Yes, because they didn't follow proper procedure." Karen snapped, as if this were a discussion about parking violations rather than a near-death situation. Ramirez took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep his composure. "Ma'am, you do realize that interfering with emergency services is a serious offense." Karen rolled her eyes. Oh, please. It was a minor delay. They got in eventually, didn't they? Mark stepped forward, shaking with anger. That minor delay could have cost Alex their life. Ramirez had heard enough. Ma'am, I need you to come with me. You're being detained for obstruction of emergency services. The smugness on Karen's face finally cracked. What? You can't do that. I was following the rules. You prevented emergency personnel from doing their job. That's a criminal offense. Ramirez gestured to another officer. Cuff her. Karen shrieked as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. You're going to regret this. I'll sue every single one of you. I'm on the HOA board. Yeah, Ramirez muttered, leading her toward the patrol car. The crowd erupted in cheers as Karen was shoved into the back seat. But while the immediate danger had passed, the battle was far from over. The legal aftermath, news of the incident spread like wildfire. By the next morning, Alex's family had been contacted, and their lawyer was already drafting a lawsuit. The charges were serious: obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment, and negligence. The HOA was also named in the suit for its policies that enabled Karen's actions. As Alex recovered in the hospital, their lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Carter, visited them. This is one of the worst cases of HOA abuse I've seen. We have a strong case. Mark, who had been visiting Alex regularly, clenched his fists. She almost killed them. She shouldn't get away with this. Rebecca nodded. We're not just suing Karen. We're going after the HOA for allowing this to happen. We need to make sure no one else has to go through this. Over the next few weeks, the lawsuit gained traction. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, the entire country was talking about the dangers of power-hungry HOA boards. Karen, now facing public outrage and legal action, doubled down on her defense. I was just following the rules, she wailed on a local news interview. This is a witch hunt against me. But no one was buying it. Residents came forward with their own horror stories. Fines for having the wrong shade of curtains, threats of foreclosure over minor infractions. The HOA had a history of overreach, and Karen had been the worst offender. During the trial, the prosecution didn't hold back. They played the 911 call, the frantic voice of the dispatcher calling Alex's name. They showed security footage of the ambulance sitting at the gate while Karen argued. They called paramedics to the stand, who testified about the dangers of delayed medical response. Karen's defense crumbled. The jury took less than a day to reach a verdict guilty. She was fined heavily and sentenced to community service, though many believed she deserved worse. The HOA was also forced to overhaul its policies under legal pressure. The gated entrance was modified with a special override for emergency services. New regulations were put in place to ensure no one else would ever be denied life-saving help. But for Alex, the damage had already been done. The trauma of that night stayed with them. The fear of being helpless, the knowledge that their life had been deemed less important than a set of arbitrary rules. It was something they would never forget. Yet, in the midst of their pain, they found purpose. They began speaking out about HOA abuses, pushing for legislative changes. What had nearly killed them had now given them a mission. And as for Karen, she lost a position on the HOA board. Her reputation was in ruins. And worst of all, in her eyes, she had been publicly humiliated. But no one cared. She had made her choices. And now, she was finally paying the price. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Karen sat stiffly in her seat, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The weight of the jury's decision pressed down on her, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. Guilty on all counts, the judge declared. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Alex, still recovering from their near-fatal medical emergency, sat beside their lawyer, Rebecca Carter, watching the scene unfold. Karen had spent the trial trying to justify her actions, claiming she had simply been following HOA protocol. But the evidence against her had been overwhelming. The paramedics' testimonies, the recorded 911 call, the security footage. Every piece of proof painted a clear picture of her reckless negligence. During cross-examination, Rebecca had leaned forward. Karen, a person nearly died. This wasn't a what if, it was real. Do you regret your actions? Karen hesitated before muttering. I regret that people are blowing this out of proportion. That sealed her fate. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Now! The judge's voice carried through the courtroom. Ms. Henderson, your actions displayed a shocking lack of empathy and a blatant disregard for human life. You delayed emergency medical assistance, putting someone's life at risk. For that, I am sentencing you to 6 months in county jail, 500 hours of community service, and restitution to the victim. Karen's head snapped up. Jail? She blurted out. The judge remained firm. Interfering with emergency services is a serious offense. As the bailiff approached, Karen turned to her lawyer in a panic. Appeal. We have to appeal. Her lawyer sighed. There's no point. You're lucky it wasn't harsher. The bailiff pulled Karen to her feet. Let's go. As she was led out of the courtroom, Alex exhaled a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. It was over. The HOA crumbles. With Karen disgraced, the HOA board came under fire. Journalists uncovered years of corruption, outrageous fines, threats of foreclosure, misuse of community funds. It turned out Karen wasn't the only one at fault. The entire board had enabled her. Under mounting legal pressure, the HOA was forced to reform. The entire board resigned. Residents elected new leadership, and the first act was dismantling the draconian rules that allowed Karen's abuse. The neighborhood gate was modified to allow emergency vehicles automatic access. Homeowners gained more rights, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a real community again. Karen's new reality. Karen's downfall wasn't just legal, it was social. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood found herself shunned. Her home, once pristine, became a target for passive retaliation. People dumped trash on her lawn. Her mailbox filled with angry letters. No one wanted anything to do with her. One afternoon, she returned from the grocery store to see neighbors whispering. The moment she approached, they fell silent. What? She snapped. An older woman, Mrs. Patel, crossed her arms. We're just wondering when you're moving out. No one wants you here anymore. Karen clenched her jaw. This is my home. Mrs. Patel didn't back down. It stopped being your home the moment you put HOA rules above a human life. Karen finally broke. Within months, she put her house up for sale. But no one wanted to buy a property associated with HOA Karen. Eventually, she sold it at a loss and left town. Alex's new purpose. For Alex, the experience had changed everything. They nearly died because of an HOA rule, and they refused to let that happen to anyone else. They started speaking out, using their story to expose HOA abuses. News outlets featured them. They testified before local governments. Their advocacy sparked legislative changes, making it illegal for private communities to block emergency services. Across the country, people reached out, sharing their own horror stories. A movement began. One evening, Mark, the neighbor who had helped them, caught up with them after a town hall meeting. You did good today, he said. Alex smiled. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I did. Mark hesitated. Oh. Karen finally moved out. Alex blinked. Seriously? Mark grinned. Yeah. She couldn't handle the fact that no one wanted her here anymore. Alex exhaled. Good. Maybe she'll learn something from all this. Mark chuckled. Doubt it. But at least she can't hurt anyone else. Epilogue. A changed community. A year later, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The oppressive HOA rules were gone. The community, once ruled by fear, now worked together. Alex still lived there. They had survived something terrible, but they had also helped create something better. One evening, as they sat on their porch, Mark walked over. You ever think about running for HOA president? he joked. Alex laughed. God, no. Mark smirked, just making sure. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt at peace. The nightmare was over, and in its place, a new beginning had taken root.